So, another quick apology. This is recorded immediately after reading Chapter 7, so my voice is actually probably a slightly bit worse than it was last chapter. Still just as almost recovered as earlier, but with the added strain of having read one chapter. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get going. Star Wars Heart of the Jedi by Kenneth C. Flint. Chapter 8. The eyes were armored with a coat of scales, save at their gold, slit-irised pupils. They swiveled back, up, down, forward, and around, turning nearly 360 degrees, and quite independently. With the area thoroughly scanned, they both switched back towards him. Luke met their gaze, his expression one of mixed curiosity and concern. Apparently, judging Luke safely helpless, the rest of the thing at last rose into view. Like a sea creature surfacing from the waves, the sand poured away around it to leave the form of a scavenging dune maggot, fully exposed. It was a large creature, 18 inches wide and 2 feet long. The compact body was squat and low to the ground. A broad back and tapered tail were covered with thick scales, while its domed head was a single, hard, smooth plate, olive brownish gray. The two eyes protruded from the top of the dome, giving the thing a full range of vision. No other features. Nose, mouth, ears, claws, or legs were visible. Luke kept still, breath held, just watching, waiting to see what it would do. He hadn't long to wait. After eyeing him some seconds longer, it lifted slightly, and something snaked out from beneath its front. It was a long, red, segmented tendril, rather like a worm, save that it was lined with many tiny barbs. It crept forward onto the hard ground, as if an exploring creature of its own, pausing with tip raised and quivering, seeming to sniff the air. It felt its way out across the entire open space from the armored creature to Luke, at last reaching the golden splats of the thick ooze dripped beside him. The tip sniffed around a spot of sap, then touched it lightly in a licking way. It lifted up, quivering more sharply, stretching out towards him and towards the pool of the liquid coagulating on his chest. It shot suddenly forward, a length of it lashing across him, the tip diving into the sap. Luke winced with pain, throwing himself about as violently as he could to shake it off. His effort worked. The tendril jerked in alarm and slid off. The barbs of it left a long, inflamed welt across his skin. He watched the tongue draw back, like a line reeled in to vanish beneath the creature, but the brief taste of the sweet gold liquid seemed to have been enough to bring it to action. A rapid drumming sound came from it as it vibrated its tail against the sand. It was making a call, and the call was answered soon. In moments, a dozen others like it surfaced from the sand all around the area. With the rest of its clan gathered, the first creature made the initiating move. It lifted from the sand. It exposed its means of propulsion, rows of tiny feet, like a millipede's. It also exposed its mouth. It was at once obvious how the other hapless victims had been stripped. The creature had no jaws, just a round, soft sucker mouth that pulsed open and closed like smacking lips, as if in anticipation of a new feast. And within that suction ring there were lines of needle-sharp teeth, the throat's flexing muscles meshing and gnashing them constantly. His flesh was destined to be suctioned from its bones and ground to pieces in this living food processor. The other creatures stayed put atop their tunnel mounds. Only this one, who seemed to be their scout, began a slow, weary crawl forward from the safety of its sand ocean onto the hard ground. Understanding his predicament, Luke wasted no more time. His only chance of escape was to free himself, before these beings latched onto him. To do that, he could pay no more heed to them or to his danger. All his will, all his attention had to be put into using the Force. He turned away from the approaching maggot and looked back to the stake, his face squeezed tight with concentration. Again, slowly, the stake began to rise. For agonizing long seconds, it was a snail race between creature and stake. The animal covered half the distance to Luke on its churning little legs. The stake crept up 3 inches, 6 inches, a foot, but there seemed to be no end to the thing. The creature paused, and its long tongue shot again from the pulsing mouth. this time swiftly snaking across to rise and slap across his chest. Luke jerked at the stinging blow, but he held on, forcing his full attention to staying at his task, ignoring the swollen stripe left as the tongue drew back. But the dune maggot, emboldened by the man's lack of response, crawled ahead more swiftly. The stake lifted another half foot. Was it moving with a bit more speed now? Luke redoubled his effort, murmuring the words, "Never doubt, never doubt, never doubt," as if they were a focusing mantra to further channel his output. The creature scooted right up to his side, its sucker lips stretched out to touch the liquid that had dripped next to him. Its tail thumped the ground energetically. In response, the others began to crawl forward. Luke kept up his effort. He couldn't let the increasing peril distract him. The stake was out of the ground a good 2 feet now, moving with a clearly greater ease. The creature beside him lifted up his head section and fixed its suction mouth against Luke's side. He gasped at the pain, but his control didn't waver. With a last surge of effort, he beckoned to the stake with a straining hand. The metal rod lifted another foot and then jerked hard sideways, pulling its last 12 inches from the ground. It shot across the sand to slap its middle into the palm of Luke Skywalker's waiting hand. Without hesitation, Luke lifted his freed arm and swung the rod around, and in one swift, powerful action, slammed its pointed head down into the maggot's back. The tip cracked through the scales just behind the armored head, the heavy stake plunging on through the body and driving deep into the sand. Slimy, green-yellow blood bubbled and sprayed from the hole. The impaled creature thrashed madly, tail drumming a death tattoo on the sand. Its sucker mouth pulled free of him, working spasmodically in its final throes. The tongue lashed out at him, slapping across his arm, but this was the last act. Tongue and owner both went limp at once. Luke yanked the stake out of the dead creature and looked around, holding the metal rod up defensively, but the others had been frightened back by the killing of the first. They'd swiftly withdrawn to the edge of the sand. Only that far, however. They hadn't completely abandoned their dinner table. Luke's battle wasn't over yet, and he still wasn't free. Again, he forced himself to ignore them, and focused the force on the other hand stake. His experience with the first had apparently honed his skill to do this special task, for the rod began to quiver, and then to rise almost at once. Just as well, too, for the death of the one creature hadn't intimidated the rest very much. In just a few moments, they had all begun to crawl forward, toward him again, tongues flicking out. Luke's powers yanked the second stake free just as they closed. This time, the pack of beings was not to be denied their meal. They attacked him all at once. They darted in from every side with sudden bursts of speed, tongues lashing out to whip across him in an attempt to distract him, as they angled for a chance to affix their mouths to his flesh. Luke struck back furiously with a long stake in either hand. He used the two as swords to slash and thrust out at the swarming maggots as best he could, while still chained down by the legs. The battle was desperate, savage, but quite brief. In a few moments, 3 more of the creatures lay thrashing in their death throes, while the rest, some grievously wounded, beat a full retreat. Luke watched the stakes held ready until the last one reached the sand and crawled painfully back into its mound, trailing a thick stream of its mucus-like blood from a gushing hole. He took a deep breath of relief and exhaustion, and lowered the makeshift weapons. He looked down at himself to assess damage. His bare torso and arms were laced with red welts from the dune maggot's lashing tongues, his whole body soaked in their sticky blood. But he was free, and he was still alive. "Bless the Force," he said aloud to the sky. Then he set about the work of releasing himself from the cuffs of his chains. High overhead, unnoticed, the form of a large, leathery-winged being cruised on in lazy circles, while keeping its close watch over events below. Two forms, swaddled loosely in the bright bands of cloth, worked to hang wet skeins of just-dyed fabric on a drying line. Several lines were strung on poles across the floor of one of the open pits. The two beings stood with baskets beside them, lifting out the still-dripping material, draping it and carefully spreading it out. 3 lines were already filled with the stuff, whose vivid purples, yellows, and reds suggested it would end up as more of the enwrapping cloth. A few similar, but smaller living forms, swathed like the others into shapeless bundles, crawled or chased around the workers, seemingly at play. Luke Skywalker peeked down at them, then withdrew from the pit's edge. He crawled on, but paused again at the edge of the next opening. A very strong and very gamey odor was wafting up from this one. He paused to peer down into it, too. This pit was being used as a sort of corral. It held a number of the ponderous, horned, and woolly beasts called banthas, which the Sand People used for transport. They stood about placidly or ate of dried scrub piled in a stone trough. Luke went on, making his way between two more openings, boldly moving towards the largest excavation at the center of the rest. Here he peered cautiously down again. This larger atrium was ringed by only 4 holes, widely spaced, instead of a central cultivated plot. There was a round stone platform, and that was surrounded by several concentric rings of curved stone benches. Clearly, this Sand People structure was used as a meeting place. No figures moved in the area below. Luke raised his head and looked around him at the surface. There were also no signs of life in there. He took a deep breath, drew up into a crouch, and hopped over the edge. The athletic prowess of a Jedi carried him down to land lightly and roll immediately into the cover of a bench. He peered out from its shelter. There was still nothing. The black holes of the opening stayed empty. Using the bench rings for cover, he crept up close to one doorway and looked through. The shadows beyond were deep in contrast with the bright outside. Nothing but vague shapes were visible. He sat still a moment, face drawn in consternation. His unarmed intrusion here was certainly a daring one. How far could he go? The answer to that was given when he stood up, and with a look of grim resolution moved to the door. He peered around the side of the opening, into the interior, saw nothing, and brashly stepped inside. Almost immediately he was backing out again. As he came into the sunshine, the light glinted on the point of a spearhead, pressed against his bare breastbone. This was followed by the length of a gaffi stick, and then the one who held it. That one was a most imposing figure indeed. The humanoid being was no doubt a warrior of the Sand People, clad in a typical brown burnous. Burnous. That's an interesting word. Burnoose. Don't think I've ever heard it before. From a height of at least 7 feet, it stared down at him through the goggling eyepiece of its desert survival mask. The being's mouth was covered by a filtration device with a front grill like 3 protruding tusks. Below this was suspected the vaporation canister of the simple breathing apparatus. A row of keen spikes thrust up from the brown, wrinkled rags swathing the large head. There seemed to be no protuberance for a nose, although the long, cone-shaped objects that stuck out from each cheek might have been meant for the nostrils. The warrior backed Luke well out of the open with the threat of his weapon. The young Jedi tried a reasoning approach. "Look, I'm not here to hurt you. Believe me, I'm no enemy. I only want to find something." There was no response at all to this. The being stood like stone. Luke tried again. "Okay, I'm sorry, I don't know your language. That doesn't mean we can't communicate. There must be some way." This time, there came from the tall figure a brief flurry of grunts and guttural sounds, wholly unintelligible. "That's something, anyway," the young Jedi said hopefully. "My name's Luke." He pointed to his chest. "Luke Skywalker." He pointed to the other. "And you?" In response to this, the figure lifted its head and gave forth a loud, low, trumpeting sound that echoed from the walls of the pit. If my voice wasn't crap, I might try a horrible impression of a sand person. The noises the Sand People make, but yeah, not even gonna try. Well, that wasn't what I was hoping for, Luke said. He looked around him with misgivings. They were swiftly realized. At once, figures appeared from other doorways. A score of similarly armed and clad warriors swarmed quickly out to form around Skywalker, the outthrust spear ends of their gaffi sticks making a bristling barrier. Luke looked all around him at the grotesque faces, gauging what to do. He looked up to the rim 24 feet above, too high, even for a Jedi's leap. But his attention was brought back to the figures by the raised voices of those around him. Several were speaking up in their snarling, barking speech. They were directing terse, hostile phrases at the tall one who had caught him, and that being was responding as aggressively. They definitely seemed to be having an argument. One warrior seemed to lose his temper and with a snarl drove in at Luke, thrusting out with his stick. But before Luke could move to defend himself, the tall one had swung in a quick countermove, knocking the other back. The tall one turned his gaze around at the rest, holding his gaffy stick up menacingly. No more challenged him. Otal! Otal! The tall warrior repeated emphatically, gesturing towards one opening. To this, there were answering murmurs of Otal and nodded heads. The group apparently agreed. The warrior pointed his stick at Luke, then lifted the weapon towards the doorway in a clear gesture for his captive to go ahead. Fine, no argument, said Luke readily. He was only too pleased to obey the one amongst his captors who seemed to wish to keep him alive, at least for the moment. The tall one moved back and let Luke walk before him, through the same doorway the young Jedi had just tried to enter. The warrior and then his fellows followed close behind. Luke stepped into what at first was a most dim room, lit only by the low flames of a few bowl-shaped lamps on poles. But his eyes soon adjusted, allowing him to see the surroundings clearly. The curved, stuccoed walls and domed ceiling were covered in elaborate frescoes of stylized creatures, abstract shapes and geometric patterns, done in browns and golds. There were thick woven carpets with similar patterns on the stone floor. Other furnishings were extremely sparse. There was a pile of large pillows on the room's far side, and along one wall was a low table filled with an odd assortment of objects. These attracted Luke's gaze. He took note of a power blender, a mechanical arm from a service droid, a pillow embroidered with a waterfall, an ivory-handed dagger in a gold sheath, and a silver-framed mirror. But his attention fell most on a globe-shaped object of which seemed a smooth, milk-white glass. His eye lit with mixed recognition and elation. The sand people trooped in behind him, all but the large warrior lined up facing the platform. That one stepped close to it. With the club end of his stick, he struck a round, beaten brass gong suspended beside it. The clang of the gong sounded loudly in the enclosed space. He stepped back to stand beside Luke. The Otal will come soon, a harsh, deep, rolling guttural voice said to Luke. The young man looked around and up in wide-eyed astonishment at the source of the voice. It was the tall warrior beside him. The being was not making more unintelligible sounds this time. He was speaking in Luke's own tongue.